What's up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about history that comes from the story in the beginning of The Secret. And this comes from the section, The Passage to the New World. There are several names in here, and if you actually do some research on them, some of these names are actually real people. And they say that fact can be stranger than fiction at times. Well, a lot of the characters in here seem to be factual, so the story, as outlandish as it may seem, might actually have a lot of truth in it. So I'm going to go through some of these names in here and I'm going to associate them with actual real people. So the first person that's mentioned here is somebody named Ruddy Alf, and he comes from Nordland. And if we were to associate this with an actual person, that would be that of Leif Erikson. And Leif Erikson was a Norse explorer who is thought to have been the first European to set foot on the continental America approximately half a millennium before Christopher Columbus. And he came from Iceland and he established a Norse settlement at Vinland. So, very interesting that in the year 1000, supposedly, a man named Leif Erikson came to America. Also, there was an interesting study back in 2010 that revealed that 80 modern Icelanders share a unique maternal Native American genetic marker, which was traced back to 4 specific Southern Icelandic lineages born in the early 1700s. This DNA suggests a Native American woman was brought to Iceland by Vikings around 1000 AD. So that seems to line up with the time frame of Leif Erikson. And I just wanted to note that in Los Angeles, we actually have a statue of Leif Erikson, and it says Leif Erikson Explorer, landed in America in the year 1000. So I don't know who put this statue up of Leif Erikson, but somebody obviously knew something that most people didn't, especially since they teach us in school that Christopher Columbus was the first person to come to America. So Leif Erikson is going to be associated with Ruddy Alf. Also, I wanted to point out that in the book they talk about dwelling in the hills and forests of the Newfoundland. Well, that's Newfoundland, basically. So, Newfoundland, same thing. Now, the next person I'm going to talk about is somebody named Brandon, and it says next or simultaneously or years and years before was Brandon. And Brandon is actually a real person as well, but his name is not spelled the same. Here it's Brendan, not Brandon. And he is one of the early Irish monastic saints and one of the 12 apostles of Ireland. He is also referred to as Brendan the Navigator, Brendan the Voyager, Brendan the Anchorite, and Brendan the Bold. He is mainly known for his legendary voyage to find the Isle of the Blessed, which is sometimes referred to as St. Brendan's Island. And we could see that St. Brendan's Island was supposedly a real island, but it was known as a phantom island or mythical island situated somewhere in the North Atlantic. It was named after St. Brendan. He and his followers are said to have discovered it while traveling across the ocean, and it appeared on numerous maps in Christopher Columbus's time, most notably Martin Behaim's Erdefell of 1492, and is known as La Isla de Saint Brandon or Barandon. So people actually believe that this Saint Brendan's Island was real, and he would have had to travel there somewhere between maybe 510 to 570 AD. So that would have been almost 500 years before Leif Erikson went. But Brendan the Navigator is supposedly and historically a real person. Now, the next person mentioned down at the bottom of the page is somebody, an Italian fairy, Colone Savinelli, uh, and he was a nautical folletto out of Genoa. That's going to relate to Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus's last name was Colon, which he adopted after moving to Spain. He was born in Genoa, Italy. So Cologne, Christopher Columbus, from Genoa. That's Christopher Columbus 100%. And I think it's an important question to ask. Where would Christopher Columbus get a map that had the Isle of St. Brendan on it, because this was something that happened in Ireland. Did he get this information from the Irish? Very interesting question to note and think about. It says the Queen of the Iberian Hatteras sent Columbus to seek the fabulous Spice Islands. Well, here it says Columbus had to wait until 1492 for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to support his voyage across the Atlantic to find gold, spices, and a safer route to the east, and converts to Christianity. So we can assume if they're talking about the Queen, they're talking about Queen Isabella, and they didn't mention a king, but that would have been King Ferdinand, and they are from Spain. So we're talking about Queen Isabella here as the Queen of the Iberian Hatteras. Then later in the text, they say, word of Savinelli's success and of the Spanish exodus ran like foxfire across the dying Middle Kingdom, and this is what inspired others. And later on the next page, they talk about in England, the erstwhile high-honored court of the fairy Queen Mab was now much diminished, and many of her subjects had shrunk to a tiny size. But this is probably most likely going to be Queen Elizabeth I. And Queen Elizabeth famously sent Sir Francis Drake, who we've talked about previously, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who we spoke about a little bit previously, to America to claim territory on behalf of England away from the Spanish, who had already started looting and taking Indian land and gold, specifically in South America and Central America. On page 14, it talks about the Scottish Highlands and how they leave the quote-unquote people of peace. They leave and they will never more be seen in Scotland. And these guys end up going, on the next page it says, to a Nova Scotia, New Scotland basically. So on the map we have Newfoundland, and then the Scottish go to Nova Scotia, New Scotland. And on page 16, they talk a little bit about somebody from the gay Farfarelli, So Dear to Dante of Florence. And Dante wrote books like Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, and his most famous is probably the Divine Comedy. And he also has a statue pretty close to where the Cleveland cask was found. If you want to research more of him, you might be able to find some of that. And then finally on page 17, they talk about somebody else. Most of the people in between there aren't exactly real people to associate with, but the last person they talk about is Prince Yi. And if you want to look him up on Wikipedia, it's under Hua Yi. And he was typically given the title of Lord Archer, and he shot down several suns that were trying to burn the earth. And it also mentions the Queen Mother, or the Golden Mother, Si Wang Mu. She has many different titles, Zi Wang Mu being one of them, but she is listed as the Queen Mother of the West. If you want to look her up and learn a little bit more about her, go for it. So now, after the original story, the next section that we would be interested in would be called The Vanishing. And just to recap real quickly, we talked about Brendan the Navigator, who was around 500 AD. Then we had Leif Erikson, who was around 1000 AD. And then it talks about Columbus and Queen Isabella, Queen Elizabeth. That would have been in the late 1400s, early 1500s was when they started sending ships to America. There is a bit of a gap that is not exactly in order. And when we look at The Vanishing, the native people refer to the people from across the sea as the shining ones from over the big sea water. And they say how long the fairy folk of the old world dwelt peacefully among the natives. No one knows. There are certainly enough Indian myths to establish the historical veracity of the immigration and cohabitation. Stories and poems about bright visitors from a far place abound. There is actually a story that happened before Columbus came. So, a few hundred years after Leif Erikson, there was a supposed voyage that happened, and I'm going to share that with you now. Now, according to the website hmdb.org, the historical marker database, supposedly there was a voyage of Prince Henry Sinclair to the New World in 1398, which is about 100 years before the voyage of Columbus. And just a quick recap, it says on June 2nd, 1398, Henry Sinclair allegedly set foot in North America on the sandbar of Guysborough Harbor. His fleet consisted of 12 ships with between 200 to 300 men on board, a considerable force designed to be self-sufficient, made up of sailors, soldiers, sailmakers, carpenters, armorers, and farming monks. Here they saw a smoking mountain in the distance, so he sent 100 of his soldiers to investigate, and then they apparently found the friendly Mi'kmaq people, and they also had an abundant supply of food. Now, if you've ever seen the show The Curse of Oak Island, in one of the episodes, they found out that a Templar flag was used, and that same flag is actually the inverse of what the Mi'kmaq Grand Council flag is. So you have to ask yourself, why would the Mi'kmaq be using a Templar flag as their Grand Council flag? Well, it would make sense that if somebody with Templar origins, like Henry Sinclair, went to Nova Scotia and met the Mi'kmaq, he might have provided it as a gift, and as a gift, they might have kept it and used it. And here you could see a Templar battle flag on top, and below you have the Mi'kmaq Nation flag. They are exactly identical, except one is upside down, basically. So, very interesting to keep in mind. If you guys want to read this, I would suggest doing so on your own. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things, some of the things that the article on HMDB talks about. The first one being the Newport Tower, and you can see here in Newport, Rhode Island, there is something called the Newport Windmill Tower, and this is what it looks like. According to the HMDB website, this is a structure that is very typical of the Knights Templar returning from the Crusades, and the buildings were modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. I talked about previously the show America Unearthed, and the host Scott Walter did a show here, season 1, episode 12 and 13. He also believes that it was built by the Knights Templar between the 12th and the 14th century. Also in Westford, Massachusetts, there's something called the Westford Knight. And if you wanted to pull it up, you can see a tablet which talks about Prince Henry I Sinclair of Orkney voyage to North America in 1398. So they believe that this is also true. And here it talks about how the stone carving was dated to the 13th to 1400s, and the sword is broken to signify the death of a knight. And according to Sir Ian Moncrieff, the Albany Herald of Scotland, this would be typical of the kind which one might expect of a knight in the entourage of Prince Henry Sinclair. And here you can see a picture of the stone carving, but in the show America Unearthed, he had to pour water on it so he can get a better view of it. But you can understand after 600 years of rain, snow, and sunshine that it would probably be weathered. So interesting to note that as well. Also, it's important to note that the Sinclair family was the family that built Rosslyn Chapel. And if you've ever seen the Da Vinci Code, you'll remember that Rosslyn Chapel was one of the places that they visited. Inside Rosslyn Chapel, there are stone carvings of Indian maize, which is corn, and the American aloe cacti, which were carved before Columbus was even born. So, how would that be possible? Well, somebody would have obviously had to come to America to see those things, probably bring them back, and then they included them in the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel, which happened about 50 years after. So here you could see some of the pictures of the corn and the American aloe cacti. So definitely interesting to note some of these things. And finally, at the bottom of the HMDB website, it says the knowledge of Prince Henry Sinclair's voyage has been known about for hundreds of years, but in the subsequent battle for land and souls, Rome decided to promote the claims of Spain and Portugal with the Treaty of Tordesillas. Henry, although known as the Holy Sinclair, did not have the ear of Rome, and he was, alas, consigned to the dustbin of history. But the real question would have been, how would Henry Sinclair have known about North America, and why would he risk his life to travel from Scotland to North America if he didn't know about it? And the answer is pretty simple. Henry Sinclair was the Earl of Orkney, and Orkney, even though it's part of Scotland, had a lot of Norwegian ties. So the Norwegian Jarldom of Orkney was not an inheritable position, but Henry Sinclair was able to attain that title. His mother was Norwegian, and so he was a mix of Scottish and Norwegian. And one thing that the Scandinavian Vikings did very well is they recorded their history. And if you ever want to look through these sagas of Icelanders, there are a lot of different sagas, but obviously one that would have stood out was the saga of Eric the Red, who traveled to North America, supposedly, and established the colony of Vinland. So if Henry Sinclair had that knowledge, had known about some of these stories, he would have been able to use that information and then use the maps that they had to travel to North America. And it makes a lot of sense given the time period, but that's all I wanted to share in this video. I hope you were able to see the connection from the story given in the beginning of The Secret to some of the things that happened in The Secret and that of the Fair People. So, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll talk to you guys next time.